Hello everyone, we're going to get started now. Welcome to LD at School's first of 4 webinars for 2014-2015. My name is Cindy Para, and as LD at School's English Educational Consultant, I will be moderating today's webinar. Funding for the production of this publication was provided by the Ministry of Education. Please note that the views expressed in the publication are the views of the recipient and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Education. The LD at School team is very pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Ryan Michette, who will be speaking to us this afternoon about transition planning and pathways for students transitioning to post-secondary, the importance of planning with the end in mind. Just to let everyone know, all webinar participants, except for the presenter, have now been muted for the remainder of the presentation. Once Ryan has finished his presentation, we will be opening up the floor for questions. Over the course of the presentation, if you would like to ask any of the LD at School team a question, you may enter your text in the bottom box of the control panel and choose to send it to the staff from the drop-down menu underneath. After the webinar, we will be sending out presentation slides as well as a link to a survey to provide us with feedback on the webinar. In approximately 3 weeks, the webinar recording will be available and we will send out a link to all participants. That takes care of all housekeeping matters, so let's get started. On behalf of the LD at School team, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Ryan Michette. Ryan is the ABA Transitions Facilitator for the Peel District School Board. Currently, Ryan works with students receiving special education supports and services at both the elementary and secondary levels, including students with learning disabilities. His role is to ensure that by connecting schools and families with community partners and resources, each secondary age student successfully transitions into adulthood in any of the pathways, including post-secondary, employment, and community. Previously, Ryan worked as a job developer with the Coalition for Persons with Disabilities, coordinating the Work Readiness Program and the Student Transition Program in partnership with the Peel District School Board. And now I will turn the presentation over to Ryan.
Thanks, Cindy. So thanks for having me to do the webinar. I'm very excited to be able to talk about transitions for students going to post-secondary. And just to reintroduce myself, my name is Ryan Michette, and I'm the Transitions Facilitator for the school board, for the Peel District School Board. And I work with all students in special education, ranging from kindergarten all the way up through till they're 21, and ensuring essentially that no student sits on the couch for 10 years after they leave us. And so my previous experience as a job developer for persons with disabilities has really helped me to sort of see what happens when a transition has gone really well for a student and when a transition has needed a little bit more work. And so it sort of carries me with a bit of sense of urgency when I'm working with students, is that I know potentially what could happen if we don't put in the proper supports for that student as they transition to adulthood. So a lot of the presentation that I'm going to be giving today is based on over the past year or so. I've attended roughly about 170 transition meetings and consulted on over 220 transition plans. And then this year, again, this school year, I should say, an additional probably, I think, about 55 transition meetings so far. Well, as of this morning, about 53. Transition meetings that have taken place. So that's where a lot of this information comes, is real-life transition meetings that are involved with parents, students, community partners, teaching staff, and advocates in the community that work with students outside of the home as well. So that's where a lot of this information is coming from, and it's important to really sort of think about what the end game is for that student. Planning with the end in mind is extremely crucial. And so what we try to establish with a lot of our students who are transitioning is, where are they going, what is a very focused plan for that particular student. Making sure that we individualize it for that student, making sure that we understand the profile of that student, and then we do sort of a gap analysis. What skills do they really need to focus on in order to get to that point where they're successfully transitioning, and then what skills we really need to focus on. And then if we build in milestones and we build in timelines and we really sort of have a focused approach and we know who's responsible, then that creates a much more fulsome transition into adulthood, regardless of the pathway, regardless of the person's disability or the person's designation within school. So that's more or less what we're going to be talking about today, and specifically for persons with learning disabilities that are going to be transitioning into post-secondary, and just how everything ties in nicely together. So. So to set the context for what it is that we're talking about, when I go in and I meet with the school and I'm meeting with a student for the possibly the first time, or I'm meeting with school staff, is that when I start the whole transition process, the question that I really like to ask is where is the student going when they graduate? It seems like a very simple question, but you'd be surprised. And so what that does by starting the conversation by where is that student going is that it really gives a focus to the conversation. It really starts to give a central point to the conversation when we talk about transitions. And then the reason being is that, and I put it back to the school and I said, well, if we don't know where the student's going, then what are we preparing them for? And so, for neurotypical students that are going into, they're in the academic or even the applied stream, we know where they're going. We know what they're going to college or they're going to university, or we know that, what exactly it is that we have to prepare the student for, because it's all very much laid out in their timetable and their curriculum. We know all of these things. So sometimes because transitions for students, with learning disabilities and students in special education, the road to adulthood and the road to transitioning into either post-secondary or employment is not necessarily linear. It tends to sort of deviate from the typical path that we would experience. So again, it's really sort of focusing in on exactly where that student is going. Are they going into employment? Are they going to post-secondary? Okay, which program? What school? Because that has a huge difference too on whether a student is going to be able to access the appropriate amount of supports that they're getting. So, not every school is the same. Not every program is the same. Not every course is the same. It's all very much different. And so when we start to talk about transition planning and where's the student going, that incorporates the transition plan. And so what I found, and what I continue to find, is that the IEP and the transition plan is really the central hub to transition planning. It's where we come back to. So whatever might change within the scope of what that person's plan is, or something changes within the school for programming, or something changes for the course, or something just changes, that we bring it back to the transition plan. Okay, well, where does this fit into the transition plan? And how is this going to create a fulsome transition for the student into adulthood? And what do we need to change in order to support that? So by doing this backwards planning, by knowing exactly where the student's going ahead of time, and we start this very early on a lot of times, is that we really start to think about what that minimum eligibility criteria is for that particular pathway or that particular course. So every pathway for a student has its own minimum eligibility. Whether it be day programs, whether it be employment, supported employment, competitive employment, college, university, it all has a minimum that students need to be in. So we try to make sure that what's expected, where are they, where are the gaps, where are the challenges, how do we then program, and the IEP and the transition plan are really what sort of drives that, and it brings us all back to that third-party focal point when we're talking about how to transition for that student. So the importance of setting those milestones is that it always gives us a next step. So when we talk about action items, or we talk about next steps, the milestones, and making sure that we set realistic expectations for what the next step is, that really will help move the whole process along. It gives us a really sort of focused approach. So how do we do that? PPM 156, which is the transition plan for students with an IEP. It's for any student. So any student from kindergarten through 21 that has an IEP now is required to have a transition plan. PPM 156 is what drives that. So just to read from the slide itself, the transition plan must be developed for all students who have an IEP, whether or not they've been identified as exceptional by an IPRC, including those identified as exceptional solely based on giftedness. The transition plan is developed as part of the IEP. All transition plans must be developed in consultation with the parent, student, the post-secondary institution, and relevant community agencies and/or partners as necessary. So it's a multi-pronged approach to making sure that all the supports are put in place with our student as they transition through, and that what we need to make sure is that as the student's moving through and as they move out is that whatever stage they're moving towards is that we layer on all of that support. We layer support as they move forward, and we try to build in a lot of safety nets, and we try to make sure that we have plan Bs, and we try to make sure we have plan Cs, and we try to make sure that everything that we, that we're trying to achieve for that student is layered in support as they move through. And so by having the family there, and by having the community partner at the table, by making sure that the right staff are at the table. I was at a meeting yesterday at a school where we had a student, parent, a teacher, we had a teacher, a teaching assistant, we had the spec ed head, and we had a community partner also at the table. And the community partner, when they came in, were shocked that we had as many people as we did for the student, but but saw very quickly that the importance of having everyone at the table discussing what this transition for the student was going to look like, really saw that it really gave a more fulsome approach to the whole idea of transitioning for the student. And so we were really able to come away from that meeting and with clear set goals of knowing what everyone's role and responsibility was for transitioning the student, and exactly what the pathway was, what supports are going to be put in place, who's going to be responsible for what. And so the transition plan was being updated as we were going through this process. And so the transition plan was where we brought everything together to make sure that all of this hard work is documented. So when we get into transition plans and what it looks like a little bit later in the presentation is that the schools already typically do transition planning. It's something that we do. We've always sort of done it. But this is a way to make sure that we're documenting all of the great things that we do. And so it's a way to make sure that we showcase all the things that we've done for the student, but it also gives us something to come back to and make sure that we're on track and we're not missing anything. Okay, so PPM, or Policy Program Memorandum Number 8, is specifically for the identification of and programming planning for students with learning disabilities. So it's very specific just for persons with learning disabilities, and students with learning disabilities, I should say. So this memorandum sets out requirements for school boards for the identification of and program planning for students with learning disabilities. The determining factor for the provision of special education programs and or services is not any specific diagnosis or undiagnosed medical condition, but rather the needs of individual students based on the individual assessment of strengths and needs. And so I think that what PPM 8, other than the fact that it points out specifically that it's for a person with a learning disability, is that I really like the line where it says the individual assessment of strengths and needs. And it really takes into account that our students, regardless of their designation or regardless of the diagnosis or regardless of a label that a student's been given, is that they're all an individual and they all have their own strengths and they all have their own needs and they all have their challenges. And there's a in ABA, when we talk about a profile of a student and what that means, it's very rich. It's very deep as far as what it is that drives a student to be successful, and some of the things that are potentially challenges for the student. Is that if we really focus on the fact that this is an individual, and this individual has a lot of great things going for them, but also has some challenges and what that looks like, and how different parts of the student's day or part of the student's profile at school can really impact how it is that they transition through and out of school, and it impacts pathways, and it impacts the necessary supports that have to happen. There's a saying with autism is that once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, and that's very true. And it's also very true with a lot of other students with various different designations and disabilities. So it's very important to keep that in mind. So what PPM 8 does is it really drives the importance that this is specifically for a person with a learning disability. So very much like for those of us that are working with students with developmental disabilities, is that the integrated transition planning protocol is specific to persons with developmental disabilities, students with developmental disabilities between the ages of 14 and 21. And so it's very specific to that group. So again, within that group, we have a lot of individual students that have their own strengths and needs and all the wonderful things that bring together their profile. So pathways. What do pathways look like? So in general, there's three pathways, more or less. I mean, we can talk about volunteering and we can talk about apprenticeships as additional pathways. But the three main pathways are employment, community living, or community life, and employment. So these pathways typically lead towards employment most of the time. So community programming it could mean a bunch of different things. It could mean building a functional independence. It could mean that they've got some volunteer. It could mean they have some employment based in post-secondary or ongoing learning. That could education outside of secondary school can mean lots of different things. But in the typical sense, it looks at post-secondary education as far as college and university. But even that is a little bit different too. Now there's programming available for students that are just graduating with an OSSC or a certificate as opposed to a full diploma. And so that's sort of changing the landscape of post-secondary education as well and what that looks like. And then you have employment, which really is not very black and white as far as what that looks like. Supported employment, competitive employment, apprenticeships, work readiness programs, what's the Youth Employment Fund and how does that impact students that are graduating as well. These are all different pathways and all very different. So when you look at sort of the hierarchy of employment, and you look at the hierarchy of pathways, is that you would sort of typically look at day programs, and then you would look at supported employment model where a person's not earning minimum wage, they're earning a stipend or an honorarium to pay for transportation, and then they get all the supports put in place that they would require to become successful, more of a training environment. And then you look at work readiness programs where they're spending time in a workshop where they would be spending time about 8 to 12 weeks generally in a workshop where it's focusing in on the soft skills towards employment. And then they go out into a job placement where they're supported still with the organization. And then you look at competitive employment, which is typically how most of us got our jobs. We had to compete for it. That's essentially what it means. Someone making more than minimum wage. Apprenticeships. Every pathway has many different paths within it. And so I think that when you really sort of explain in transition meetings that every pathway really has many avenues to achieve success in that pathway, then it really sort of opens up the conversation and we can have a more fulsome conversation and explain, what is it exactly that this student's going to be doing within this pathway. It's, I think a lot of times students feel that they're on their own trying to find jobs, and it's actually not even close to being the case. So we're trying to, explain to them that just because you picked employment as your pathway doesn't necessarily mean now you're on your own. So it's, again, just trying to sort of build in what all those different bridges are for each one of those pathways. Okay, so to sort of explain, because when you go to post-secondary education and you go to college or university, you go on with your education. Eventually, you want to get a job, and so when we look at the unemployment statistics for persons with disabilities, it's very high, and so I've got some stats that I pulled from the last survey I could find, which was in 2006. They might want to update it. I don't know. But for youth age 15 to 19 is what the cross-section was. We're looking at youth with disabilities and youth without disabilities. And so we're looking at a difference between the numbers for males and numbers for females. And so as you can see, the numbers themselves sort of speak volumes as to the high unemployment rate for youth with disabilities. And so, what does that mean? And so I don't think that it means, well, I know that it doesn't mean that, these students or these youths can't find employment. It just means that, well, maybe we're not looking in the right area. And I think that one of the things that I really try to impress upon people when I meet with them, when we talk about employment as a pathway, is that only 10% of jobs are posted. And so I think that that creates a little bit of confusion. What do you mean only 10% of jobs are posted? And I think that what that means is that a lot of companies are small and they don't have the budget to place advertisements, and it's a lot of word of mouth, and a lot of people find jobs just through this hidden job market, which is talking to people talking to people that you meet on the bus. I mean, it could be anything. It's just that these jobs are usually found, the old saying of "it's not what you know, it's who you know." I mean, it's a saying for a reason. It's actually kind of true in this case. So you have 90% of the population of job seekers applying for 10% of the jobs. It doesn't really create much of an environment to promote success. So I think that when we're talking with our students about transitioning to employment, and eventually when they do leave post-secondary, they will be looking at employment, is that we really want them to understand that there is the hidden job market, and that if you put all of your emphasis on trying to access that 10% because you see ads on the various different job posting sites, is that you're limiting your success rate extremely in some cases. There's some people that are, it's not very uncommon for HR managers and recruiters to be receiving about 300 applications for just one job. So to optimize success, we want to make sure that they're looking at the hidden job market. And I always laugh when I hear students say, "Oh, I've applied everywhere." Well, really, you've applied everywhere? So in Mississauga, there's over 12,000 employers on the Mississauga Business Registry. Are you sure you've applied everywhere? Because I'm pretty sure you'd be a lot more tired right now if you actually did apply everywhere. So, it's having those real conversations with some of our students and explaining that, maybe you need to change your tactic a little bit. So more stats on this is for neurotypical mainstream students that are going through the whole process. They've gone through either academic or applied courses. They're going into post-secondary. These give us some numbers on the dropout rates or graduation rates as well for some students. So you can see the numbers there. Graduated 69%, 67%, 64%, pretty average dropout rate, 16, 25%, and so on. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the success rate that a lot of our neurotypical or mainstream students have. And then we look at our dropout rates for students with learning disabilities. It's they're very high and alarmingly so. And so this was based on a report done by Queens, and it says that the dropout rate for students with learning disabilities is about 2 or 3 times higher. They drop out of high school, 2 or 3 times more often. They don't enroll as often in a lot of post-secondary programs. And then the post-graduation rate of students is as low as 3.6% as compared to 62.1% for non-disabled peers. So it's very high. And I think that it's important to understand that it's not because they can't do the work. It's not that they can't do it. It's just that they're not accessing the right amount of support. And so I think that it speaks volumes to the fact that we need to prepare students a lot better for post-secondary education, and not in the sense that we're going through the curriculum, or we're preparing them curriculum-based. I think that it's more about accessing the supports and understanding what supports are available at the post-secondary level. We do a lot for students, and we do have a lot of supports for students at the secondary level, and I think that those different the services are much different at the post-secondary level, and do we know enough about them to really prepare the students for what it is that they're going to be accessing when they go to post-secondary. So student services at the post-secondary level, they're expected, the students, I should say, are expected to actually disclose, and the students are expected to, seek out these services. They won't seek out the students. I mean, in schools they know that, but I think that there's an opportunity for a lot of times for us to actually have our students mimic what it would be like at post-secondary. I think that if we really sort of try to build in that capacity for those students to ask for their supports and to fade some of that support for the student, to try to build in that that ability to self-advocate and to disclose and to try to get some of those supports back that have been slowly faded away, then I think that gives them an opportunity to practice that in secondary. And so it's we talk a lot about self-advocacy, and it's one of the main goals in our transition plans is build self-advocacy. And I think that we really need to take a look at what that actually means and how do we do that. And I think that by scaling back a lot of that support slowly for a student at an earlier age, and then have that student, if they require it, to then ask for it, and how do they disclose, and do they understand their profile, do they understand their abilities and their skill level, do they understand what challenges they have and how to accommodate that, then I think that really builds in a natural advocacy for that student, is that they'll know how to ask for that support. They'll know what areas they really need to have help on. And I think that if we really start to fade that support, but encourage them to understand their profile and understand how it is that they are, the challenges and accommodations that they have as students, I think that that's when we really start to look at what advocacy will be like for that student at post-secondary. They will know that they need to ask for this or ask for that. So I think that if we do that at a secondary level, I think it gives the students a much better opportunity to practice that level of support. So student services, I've met with a lot of students that don't really know what student services is. I think they might have some sort of an idea. Some of the questions that have come up are printed on the slide here. So like, what does it look like? Is it one size fits all? Who takes care of the arrangements? What kind of accommodations can I get? Does the diagnosis or the designation I have on my IEP matter? And if I don't have this designation, they won't offer this service or whatever. And it's actually it really doesn't have much to do with designations. It doesn't really have to do with much other than the student really has to advocate for what it is that they want. They have to actually ask for it. Researching and planning is key when it comes to student services. Not every institution offers the same level of support. One of the most important things I can really say that has assisted in a very successful transition to post-secondary is that we actually go and meet face-to-face with student services ahead of time. We had a very successful transition for a student to post-secondary at UTM, which consisted of us meeting twice ahead of time with student services and this particular student who needed a fair amount of support, but was able to get into university, just needed some accommodations put in place. And so we really worked closely with the university to make sure that all of what it is that had been done at the secondary level could be replicated at the post-secondary level. And so once we ironed out all the details, and they were very accommodating, very easy to work with, but if we had just sort of sent the student off on their own and said, okay, good luck, I hope it goes well, here's the number you need to contact, that face-to-face meeting is extremely crucial to make sure that they understand the needs of the student's able to then explain what it is that they need, and that information is documented properly in the IEP, because the post-secondary institutions really want to sort of see what that looks like on paper and how they can really sort of replicate that. So it's a multifaceted approach to actually getting that. So this is an example of a website from Queens, And again, I'm just using Queens just because they wrote the report that I was using earlier. It's not to promote Queens or anything. It's just that this is just an example of a website and how easy it actually is to to see what's available. So it's got registration, it's got accommodations, examples of accommodations, student frequently asked questions. It's a very brief, but it gives a very good idea to a student exactly what it is that they could be looking for when they're looking for student services. And so every university and college obviously has their own layout for what it is, exactly what that looks like. But again, just to give you an idea that that is essentially what a student services page could look like. So just to take one step further, when you actually go into the registration page, that it's just got 3 easy steps. This is what you need, this is how you book an appointment, and it actually recommends in here that you would book an appointment with disability services. And I think that the fact that they've emphasized that is that it really sort of really makes you want to make sure that you have that appointment booked with student services to have that face-to-face meeting. And so having an IEP with clearly defined accommodations and barriers for the student services at a post-secondary level, and that's absolutely true, is that, again, sort of like the transition plan itself as well, is that we do all these really great things, but if we don't have it documented, it's hard to sort of carry that forward into the transition into adulthood for our students. And so when a student's going to university or going into college and they really need that additional support, it's important that we have it documented and exactly what that looks like. Teachers at a post-secondary level will understand the language used at a secondary level by the teachers that were implementing the accommodations for that student at secondary as well. Okay. So every student from grade 7 to 12 is going to be doing an individualized pathway planner. And so, what does that look like? The idea of the individualized pathway planner is that we really start to take a look at earlier on in grade 7, what are some of my options when I'm going to be transitioning into adulthood? What are some of those things, or what are some of the pathways, whether it be employment, post-secondary, what does that sort of look like? And it really gives students a really sort of clear understanding of what that could potentially look like. And as long as the students actually use it to its full potential, I think that sometimes they use it for course selection, and then that's pretty much it. Especially the PDSP uses myblueprint.ca. It's a great tool. Obviously not an endorsement, just saying that that's just what we use, so I know it, and I know it pretty well actually. And so what the really nice thing about it is that it gives you an opportunity to have a really realistic conversation with students. And so there are some students that maybe in locally developed courses, or might be in are going to be getting their OSSC as opposed to an OSSD, but they want to move on to university and they're going to be a doctor. Well, instead of saying, instead of the school saying, well, actually, what, you're not going to be able to do that, or we don't think that that's going to be a possibility, is that we can really sort of support them in their ideas and what it is that they want to do, but we use my blueprint as a way to sort of have a realistic conversation. So if they fill out their entire IPP and it comes back and says, well, these are all your options that are available to you. It's this pathway, it's this pathway, and here's all the different courses that are available to you at the post-secondary level. Here's all the different occupations that came up that matched your profile. Then it really gives us an opportunity to sort of sit down and have this really realistic approach to transition planning, because now it's realistic. Now we're saying, well, it's not us saying that it's this is more of a realistic approach or a realistic pathway. It's actually my blueprint saying that, or it's your IPP saying it. So that's one of the many reasons why I like to do it. But I think that one of the most important things about the IPP is that it really gives us an opportunity to work alongside the transition plan. It really gives us a way to sort of validate what it is that we're doing with the transition plan. And one of the one of the things that helps us with planning with the end in mind, and then sort of chaining backwards, establishing milestones, making sure we're on the right path, is that we can actually see what potential employers we could be working for as you go through your IPP. It'll actually give you up-to-date job postings that are available. And so one of the recommendations I always give is look at who you're actually going to be potentially working for if you know what your plan is, and then make the call. And ask them where you should be going. Ask them what college they recommend. Ask them what university they recommend. Ask them, make sure you have all the information before you start making these major financial and decisions that can last a few years as well. And I think back to when I was a job developer, and I've told the story many, many times in transition meetings, especially for students that are looking at post-secondary. When I was a job developer, I used to work with a client of mine who was deaf, and she wanted to be a pharmaceutical technician. And so found a school that offered American Sign Language. It was a university in the States. It was a 4-year course. Took pharmaceutical technician course, got a degree, stayed on for another 3 years to do co-op, came back up to Canada and Mississauga, and was ready to find a job. Her file was mine, so I was working with her to do job development and find her a job as a farm tech. And I thought this would be the easiest thing in the world. I'm like, it's great. We've got 4 years university, got a degree, you've got all the requirements that they're asking for. Piece of cake, no problem. So applied, many, many, many times. And maybe after about the 12th application that we applied for jobs, that were posted, again, only accessing 10% of the job market, but in this case we didn't really have much of a choice, given the job that she was applying for. And so didn't hear anything back. We were starting to get a little frustrated. So I started to call the HR managers and I said, what's going on? What's happening? Why are we not getting a call back? Is there something that we're not doing right? And so the HR manager, every single HR manager I called was extremely accommodated, took the time to talk to me. It was no problem at all. And they went through all the resumes that came in. It just happened that a few of them had like 300 applications, but they eventually found the resume that came in from my client, and they said, well, what we've done is the short list is that we only took resumes that had a post-secondary education from Centennial College. I'm not promoting Centennial. I'm just saying that that's who it was that this particular case was. And so they said, well, we only hire from this institution. And I said, okay, only that institution? Yeah. And the reason that they explained was that the industry leaders wrote the curriculum for that particular institution. And so they knew that if they were going to be recruiting, that they wanted to go through this particular institution because they helped write the curriculum. And so it makes sense. And so they would only hire from one particular institution. So I called a few other companies, and I started getting a very sort of similar answer. And so, not all of them were Centennial. Some of them were different programs. But what happened was that it became very evident that a degree or a diploma is not a degree and a diploma from every single school, so that it's very different. And so I always talk to students and say, well, wherever it is that you want to go, whatever job it is you want to do, call employers, if you're comfortable, or send an email, or I'll do it, or, find somebody you're comfortable with and ask the questions, and ask those specific questions. When you're hiring entry-level staff, where do you hire from? What are your qualifications? A job posting does not give you all the information that you need. It actually gives you a very small percentage of the amount of information that you need to apply for a job. So I always recommend call the employer, find out exactly what it is that they're looking for, find all the little details that aren't printed in the posting, and then that gives you an idea of exactly where it is that you should be putting your money and your time. And so, if this had been done ahead of time, it would have saved my client, 7 years, well, 5 years, because it was a 2-year course, and thousands of dollars. And so, then we had to go through the whole process of starting over again. So, I know what that looks like when they've transitioned, and I try to instill that in the students I work with to say, do the forward planning, make sure that you have that end in mind, and that you have the facts before you start putting a lot of money into your post-secondary education. So, PBI 156 and transition plans. What does a transition plan look like? Who's involved? Responsibility of actions, and then what do I do with it? So the transition plan is the last page on the IEP. Who's involved? Again, I sort of talked about it earlier. Is it the parents, the students, the school, community partners, anyone that's going to be sort of carrying the baton, as it were, in the relay race of the student's life, is that who's going to carry that support forward for the student when they leave when they leave secondary and move into life. So that's who needs to be at the table. And then what do you do with the transition plan? So this is an example of a very rough example of what a transition plan looks like. And so it's the areas that we want to pay particular attention to are the goals, the actions, the persons responsible, and the timelines. And so the this is essentially how it's sort of laid out. We have our goals. Usually, typically, 1 or 2 goals is a good starting point for a lot of students, and then the actions. Each goal might have 2 or 3 actions that are attached to that one goal. Who's responsible, timelines. The person's responsible, and I'll get into it a little bit later too, is that because the school owns the IEP, the school is really ultimately responsible for the transition plan. Now, we do assign some responsibility, obviously, to the student. We assign some responsibility to the parents, but again, because we are the ones that have access to it, and we are the ones making changes, and we are the ones driving this IEP and driving the transition plans, that as a school, we really need to make sure that we're not putting things on other people and expecting them to do everything. So we need to have a level of responsibility attached to the transition plan itself. Okay. So the example of some goals and actions. So the way I try to explain when I'm talking about a transition plan to staff and to parents and to students and anyone in transition meeting is that the goal is the what. The goal is the what are we doing. So the what is to support student with transitions from elementary to secondary school. That's a what. Another what would be to support students with transition to post-secondary education. That's a what. And then the action is the how. How are we going to do that? How are we going to then support that student to achieve this particular goal? So in this case, we're going to look at developing an understanding of the learning profile, their strengths and their needs. We're going to incorporate the student voice in the IPP. We're going to link family with community agencies and supports. So we're making sure that whatever it is that we're trying to achieve is then detailed with the how. So sometimes it can get kind of confusing for schools in that well, what's a goal and what's an action? And I think that the best way to really sort of explain that is that you want to think of it in terms of what and how. So that's my recommendation on when you're laying out a fulsome transition plan, is that you really sort of look at those 2 areas, and that's what we mean by that. So at the Killderston School Board, we have a very lengthy exemplar of the different examples of transition plans for each designation of student. And so we really get into the understanding of what that what is and what that how is for each student at each designation. So I recommend that you really sort of understand your student and understand their profile as you get into their goals and get into their actions. So then just to take another look at the other parts of the transition plan is persons responsible and then timelines. And so like I was saying, that the person's responsible is that we want to make sure that we put the responsibility on the people that are actually going to achieve these goals, but we also want to take a look at who's ultimately responsible. Who's ultimately responsible, again, is to make sure that the school is assisting as we move on with these transition plans. And so when we look at timelines, again, it's building in those milestones. You want to be specific. You don't want to say ongoing for everything. That's why I kind of put the asterisk beside the ongoing, because if you put ongoing for everything, well, that doesn't really actually give us a timeline. It just basically says we're perpetually working on it, but now there's no real sort of sense of urgency to getting that done. So again, if you're going to put in goals and actions, person is responsible, make sure that when you put in the timeline that it's a specific timeline. That it will keep you on track, of when it is that you need to have those goals completed. So when we look at different resources that are available, there's many different resources that are available for transition planning. There's the Implementing Ongoing Transition Plans for the IEP, which is, and it's an American publication, but the thing I like about this is that it actually gives you a flow chart essentially of, if student A is here, then this is what they would need in order to get to this destination. And it really sort of lays it out year to year for a student, and that's one of the things that I really like about it. Transition Planning or Resource Guide is a ministry-delivered tool on the web. And the nice thing about it is that it's not a paper copy. You can't get, stolen from someone's office and then never returned, which happens all the time, or it can't get left to school or damaged. It's on the web. It's easy to go through. It's a very user-friendly guide. Growing Together is a PDF that's done through MCYS, and so another excellent guide that gives some great statistics on if you have that kind of brain to be able to process all those stats. But again, it's a really great guide that gives a fulsome idea of what transitioning for students look like as they transition. And so, to me, one of the resources that I find are the most helpful when it is that we're doing transition planning is the students, it's the parents, it's the community partners, and it's starting the conversation. It's hard to take what's been written in a book and then duplicate that for a student who is completely unique and has their own set of environmental issues maybe, and has some challenges that they can't really be defined by their designation as a learning disability per se, or any other type of disability. Is that when you start to have a conversation, you start to involve people in the transition planning, and we start to involve all the people that are a part of the student's day. When we look at there's really sort of three parts to a student's day. There's school, there's home, there's a community, and if a student is having to readjust every time they go to a new part of their day, it makes things very difficult for them when they try to learn skills and when they try to transition effectively into adulthood. And so if we really bring all parts of their day and all the people that are involved with them on a regular basis, and we make sure that we're all moving in the same direction, then that really creates an environment for the student to generalize all the skills that are being taught, and it gives all the people involved an opportunity to learn, well, maybe this really works well at home, and maybe we can replicate that in school, and then vice versa. And we really start to have this really fulsome conversation that gets everyone motivated to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to transition the student effectively out of secondary. So again, resources are an absolute critical tool to transition planning, and it's a great way to get, to get a starting point. But again, that conversation and that meeting and the way to sort of pull out all this information that we need from the people that are involved is going to really drive a successful transition. So one of the things that we have is a transition advisory committee that already exists. It's for students with developmental disabilities, and we're a committee that helps students with developmental disabilities transition into adulthood. And so we've got a lot of representation from different community partners that work with students with developmental disabilities. We've got both school boards. We're very involved. We do a lot with planning groups to try to make sure that any of the challenges and issues that are faced in the developmental disability community are addressed, and that we're advocating, and we really have our finger on the pulse of what's available, because we have the involvement of all of the key people and organizations that are at a table that address a lot of these issues. So I guess my question to the learning disability community is that would a TAC or something along those lines be beneficial to discuss specific issues that are prevalent in the learning disability community? And would something like this be a benefit to involve the school boards and different organizations? So, I mean, again, I'm putting that out to the community as a whole to say, would a model like this be beneficial in transition planning for students with learning disabilities as they move into adulthood, specifically post-secondary education and/or employment? So I'll leave that with the group to have a discussion, and see if you really sort of think about if that would be beneficial for your community. So again, to some of the members that are a part of our TAC for students with developmental disabilities we've got Aaron Oak, Peeler School Board, the Catholic Board, we've got Carrie's Place. These are all sort of, it's a cross-section of a very large list of participants. We've got almost 50 participants in the committee that have various roles. Some get the minutes, but some actually attend. We have a very good representation from, we try to have representation from every aspect of a student's life that could be affected by their disability, and how do we get them to the next stage of their life, and it's covered by the support of all of these community agencies. And so that's why the committee has been so successful over the years. So service coordination, not to get too far into service coordination, but there is service coordination model offered through Community Living, Carey's Place, Narrow and Oak Kids. And what they do is that they are the person who has their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the community. They're the ones that will help families navigate things like respite. They'll help them navigate things like programs, funding. Will attend transition meetings. That is the role of the service coordinator. They're sort of like a liaison for the family and the student in the community, because navigating a lot of the supports that are available through government and through various agencies can get very confusing, and so their role is extremely important in making sure that all of those steps are put in place, and that they then carry on with a student after a student would transition from secondary. They then take that role of support on past when the student's out of school and work with the family. So they're who we hand over all the support to. So again, would something like that work well in the learning disability community? Would something like that, somebody who's responsible for, that transition, that fulsome transition in the LD community, would that be something that would work well specifically for that, diagnosis? So I'll leave that up to the group to discuss. So that is the end of the presentation, and I think that what I want everyone to take away from this is what can we really do to ensure that the student skills, challenges, accommodations, and interests are being captured at every stage of a student's transition to post-secondary life, and how do we make sure that all the supports are put in place to have a smooth transition into adulthood, whatever that pathway might be. So how can we really strive to do a better job and to reinforce the things that we're doing really well, and how do we make sure that all these best practices that are being put in place, and everyone's doing a great job, how do we get that out to the community as a whole to make sure that we have the same transition successes in all levels? So that's my question to you, and I'll take any questions that might be available.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for presenting on such an interesting and important topic. If anyone has any questions, please click the Raise Hand button on your control panel to be unmuted to ask a live question to Ryan, or type your question into the chat box on your dashboard, and I will read your question to Ryan. Okay, so our first question for Ryan. Are recent psychoeducation evaluations necessary?
In what sense?
I believe the question is referring to our psychoeducational assessments necessary for acceptance to a post-secondary institution.
When it comes to supports for post-secondary institutions, is that it's important to have updated accommodations that have been put in place, an updated profile of the student to ensure that up-to-date supports can be put in place for that student. A lot of that would come from the IEP. The post-secondary institution doesn't necessarily care about the designation of the student. They don't really care about the diagnosis per se. It's more about the profile of the student and how they can best support the student. If a student's been accepted to university or accepted to college, is that they're already in. So anything that they would need to be accommodated is usually taken care of by that meeting with student services. It's usually taken care of by information that's put in the IEP. An updated psychoeducational assessment is really best disseminated by another psychologist. So as student services, as long as you're explaining what's in it and explaining some of the accommodations that a student really needs, then that's what's most important.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ryan. We now have a live question from Linda Slater. Linda, you are unmuted, so please go ahead and ask your question. Okay, Linda, I'm not sure what has happened there, so we'll go on to the next question. This one is from Karen. And Karen, you are unmuted now, so please go ahead. Well, we're not quite sure what has happened with Linda and Karen, but we do have another written question. This question is from Tom. What post-secondary programs are available for students who are in locally developed streams?
Okay, so if a student is going to be graduating with an OSSC or a certificate program, is that what you're asking? So what that would be is there's programs called CICE, or Community Integration Through Cooperative Education. These courses are offered at several colleges in the area, and what they do is they focus on the college experience. They'll do co-op placements on campus. They'll do co-op placements out in the community. They'll really focus on those functional, independent skills that will help a person become successful in adulthood. It's not a diploma course in the traditional sense. There is a curriculum. There's a very it's a classroom setting that is very mainstream. It's got professors. It has a classroom maybe of 20, 30 participants, and they really get into what it is that the person is going to need in order to be successful long term in their adult life, and building in some employment into that as well. Those are the CICE programs. There's also another program offered through George Brown College. I'm just speaking of what's in the GTA. There's a program at George Brown which is a vocational program. It's strictly employment-based, 1 year I believe, and there's a vocational plus part of that, which is where a person can go through the vocational program and then have access to other college programs offered through George Brown if they're able to meet the requirements of that. Centennial offers a great program which is food processing and packaging, and so what that does is they've partnered with a company called Corebrook out in the East End, and Corebrook vets all of the participants that are applying into the program. Corebrook would then filter the participants into the program at Centennial. Centennial houses the program and teaches the program, but what has happened is that they've partnered with employers in the community that help write the curriculum for that particular program. So at graduation, Corebrook would then come in, work with the graduates, and then place them into direct employment because they're now employment ready. So it's a direct line of access to employment. So any of a lot of our students that are interested in working in the food industry, not necessarily in a restaurant per se, but in sort of the industrial sense, is that we find that that's a really great program to put them in because it's a direct line to employment. So those are some of the programs that are available specifically for students that do not have a diploma from secondary.
Okay, that's great. Very comprehensive response, Ryan. We have another question here. It actually starts off with a comment, and then there's a question from Lori Ann. It's wonderful that your board has a position like yours, Ryan. to provide support and direction. How do you think transitions can be supported in boards without someone in your dedicated job?
Well, thank you. Well, there's in the Pearson School Board, there's 25,000 students in special education, identified, non-identified. So, I mean, for me to get out to every single one of those students is impossible. So, I try to do my best to build capacity with a lot of the schools. And I think that for school boards that don't necessarily have a dedicated person for that particular role, is that PPM 156 and the Integrated Transition Planning Protocol are mandatory for all school boards in Ontario, and so that is what should be driving the schools to transition for our students. And I think that as long as school boards have started to build that capacity to work with community partners and really learn from their community partners that are going to be a huge part of our student lives when they leave us, is that they can really actually teach a lot to the schools on how to build in successful transition planning, because that's where they're going when they leave us. So, at the beginning when I said if we don't know where they're going, then what are we preparing them for? I think that if we really get to talk to the people and get to know the people that know exactly where they're going when they leave, they can then help us prepare our students a lot better. So I think that it's asking a lot of questions, it's ensuring that we know where the student is going, and then we have to sort of see what the barriers are or the challenges the student might face as they're transitioning through, and then building in whatever supports we need, not necessarily within the school or just within the school, but also within the community and bringing everyone together to have that conversation. So the schools, a lot of times they're doing these things, they just don't realize they're doing it. So get to know where they're going, get to know the supports that are out there, and then that will drive the transition for these students.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ryan. We're going to give Linda another try here. Linda, you are now unmuted if you'd like to ask Ryan your question. Okay, so Linda, in this case, if you wouldn't mind typing out your question for Ryan, and we can come back to you that way. So we do have another question from Evangeline. Ryan, can you be more specific about the methods you would use to teach self-advocacy? This seems to be a crucial skill.
Sure. So I think that when we're talking about teaching students specifically on how to self-advocate, and I think that they need to have a full understanding of what it is exactly that's being provided to them at the school level. So I think that a lot of students kind of go through their day-to-day, and the support that they receive is just sort of a given. It's something that was set up, sometimes even without their understanding of what's actually being put in place. And so I think that the first thing to do is to fully explain to students exactly the level of support that they're getting. This is why you have a teaching assistant. This is what your teaching assistant, is working with you on. This is the modifications that are done in your classroom, and the reason being is because of X. And I think that as long as a student starts to really sort of understand their learning profile and starts to understand the level of support and the details of each support put in for them, is that as you start to scale back some of that support, they'll notice that it's not there anymore. And you want to start to teach the student to start asking for that support again, and to start teaching that student to either develop strategies in order to accommodate themselves, or to actually ask for that support back. And so I think that building in natural advocacy in a student is by drawing some of that support away, and then making sure that they have the ability to understand that it's missing, and then to ask for it, and then to ask for help. And I think that if it's done at an earlier age, I think that will then build the capacity of the student to start asking for it as they get older and move into the older grades, and then move into post-secondary education. And so if we just constantly are presenting with the accommodation and presenting with all the support without really sort of an understanding by the student of why they're getting it, then I think that if we do that, we take away the ability for the student to actually ask for that support and for the student to actually understand that this is why they are getting that support. And self-advocacy means many, many different things. And I think that if you can sort of generalize for a student, you know, remember when you asked for that, or do you remember when this happened and you know, stepped in and you know, requested this? I think that if we point out real-life examples of when they've already done that, then we can say, this is what you need to do here. And, you know, would you feel comfortable in, you know, asking for that support in this particular area? And for them to understand that at post-secondary, this is what it's going to look like for you, then they can start to look at how to generalize those questions and generalize those requests.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. I'd also like to make mention of the fact that the LD at School website has many excellent resources on self-advocacy and how to develop self-advocacy in students. We have an overwhelming number of questions, which is absolutely wonderful to see. And I'd like to thank Mary Ann for sending in a very comprehensive comment that addresses a number of questions that we've received about the need for the psychoeducational assessment. So Mary Ann says, as a representative from a university disability office, I can confirm that yes, most institutions require an updated psychoeducational assessment for students with a diagnosed learning disability. We prefer that the assessment be no more than 3 years old. It is best for each student to make contact with the disability office at the post-secondary institution they are considering to find out the specific requirements. An assessment is not required to be admitted to university, but it is required to be considered for academic accommodations once they are admitted. And again, thank you very much, Mary Ann, for providing that update and clarification. Okay, Linda, thank you very much for submitting your question in writing. Ryan, how do you think we as a university disability service can best get information to staff in secondary schools? I think because we have everything online now, there are perhaps fewer mailings of hands-on materials to you.
I think, well, there's lots of secondary schools to make contact with, and I realize that going in and speaking to everyone individually is not possible. But I think that possibly arranging more tours for teachers to actually sort of see what student services actually looks like. There's a lot of teachers that I work with that have never been to student services. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know. They know on paper kind of what it is, but I think that they need that sort of real life experience of what that is and what it can be offered for students. And I think that if it's possible to make more of a personal connection with the school boards, to have that support for the teachers to be able to really sort of explain because they know, because they've seen it, because they've experienced it, then I think that they can then give that information better to the students. So I mean, you know, the teachers, yeah, can go online and they can look and they can sort of pass that information along. But what I've found a lot of times in transition planning is that when we just sort of send information and we expect people to sort of understand it and execute on it, a lot of times it doesn't get done because it's just it's very, everyone has a different learning style, and even, you know, neurotypical teachers a lot of times can sometimes have difficulty sort of understanding what it is that they're looking for. So I think that really sort of that connection, that personal connection to the schools and the school boards, and knowing that they can call somebody and knowing that they've seen it, they've experienced it, I think that that's really an important piece to getting a much better transition into university as well. So.
Okay, thank you very kindly, Ryan. We have time, I believe, for just a couple more questions, and all the questions that have been posed by our participants will be answered by various LD at School staff. So Ryan, how do you feel the role of the educational assistant or teaching assistant fits into this transition process? How do you see EA's role in supporting transitions in the future?
I see it as being one of the most important roles, to be honest with you. I know that educational assistants and teaching assistants, because they work so closely with students, is that they can really um, they really have that up close and personal approach with those students, and they can actually drive a lot of the things that we want. We sit in meetings and we come up with plans and we come up with goals and actions, and we have all of these great things that we think are really going to work. But then the people that work closest to the student, every day are really the ones that are going to be able to make sure that we're enhancing those skills that have been targeted for those students. So I think that educational assistants and teaching assistants and IRFs and every other acronym that we have for teaching assistants and educational assistants, is that they're the ones that are on the front line, that are able to execute on a lot of these goals and actions that we have for students in order to build things like advocacy and to ensure that a lot of the goals and actions that we put in the plan are actually being executed. So I think that I try to get EAs out to transition meetings as often as possible. I try to have their input put on the table when we're coming up with goals and actions, because they're able to contribute a level of understanding about the student's ability and certain challenges and accommodations that sometimes teachers don't necessarily have the full picture, or they don't. The community partner might not have, or the teachers might, or the parents might not have. So the EA contribution to the transition plan is absolutely crucial.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ryan. Okay, so our last question is from Patricia. Referencing the new PPM 8 guidelines regarding the identification of students with learning disabilities, what provisions are being made by post-secondary institutions to accommodate students who are not identified as having a learning disability, but on non-exceptional IEPs at the secondary level?
That is an excellent question.
Thought you would like that one.
Thank you for saving that one for last. That's an excellent question. The profile of a student and the learning profile of a student, I think, is going to be really sort of what drives any accommodations that might be put in place for students. So if a student accesses student services and tries to get support for any sort of challenge that they might have at the post-secondary level, PPM 8 really drives the IEP. Now at a post-secondary level, I'm not 100% sure how much that really sort of influences what the supports are at post-secondary. So I mean, I would love to turn this over to our experts at the post-secondary level to see if they have maybe something to add. We had a very comprehensive comment earlier about the psychoeducational assessment. So I mean, if there's a way to possibly connect with the people that are on the ground, as it were, at the university level, to have some insight into that question. I mean, I'd love to sort of hear what the answer would be to that, to be honest with you.
Okay. Okay, that's great. And Ryan, just as a follow-up to your response there, I'd like to thank Linda for sending in this additional comment that individuals can check the documentation guidelines at the specific post-secondary institution that they're considering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Linda.
And additionally, it'll show which areas of disability can in fact be accommodated and what those accommodations would look like. Okay, that's all the time we have for today. So we're going to end our question and answer session at this time. If you have any additional questions, please email us at info@ldfschool.ca, and we will ensure all of your questions get answered. And as I indicated, we have many excellent questions here that I think all the participants would appreciate receiving responses to. Also, please email us if you have any success stories or best practices related to post-secondary transition planning that your school and or your school district would like to share. If you would like to be kept up to date with events such as our free webinars, please subscribe to LD at School's bi-weekly newsletter. You can do this on the LD at School homepage by entering your email in the sign-up box located at the bottom of the page. You can also be kept up to date about things like free webinars by following LD at School on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LDAtSchool. And on behalf of the LD at School team, I would again like to thank Ryan Michette for his presentation, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us. Please remember that we will be sending out presentation slides as well as a short survey following today's webinar. The feedback we receive through this survey provides us with important information for producing future webinars. Also remember that we will be sending out a link to this recorded webinar in approximately 2 weeks. Thank you again for participating in this LD at School webinar, and have a wonderful day.